Hello, my name's Paddy. I'm the Mind Guy, and I'm a mental health advocate and logistics consultant. I've helped hundreds of professionals in the logistics industry with their mental health challenges, both in and out of the workplace. April is Stress Awareness Month, so I'm trying to speak to professionals from across the industry to find out what they've got to say about stress. Today, I'm joined by John Henderson. He's a director from Sara Penrose Limited. They're a training and consultancy business that help growing businesses adapt to change and build cultures of continuous improvement. Before that, he's worked in temperature-controlled FMCG logistics, most recently as the commercial director for Culina in Spalding. Good morning, John. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, Paddy. Morning to you too. Very well, thanks.
Excellent, excellent. We will dive straight in, shall we, with question number one, which is, can you tell us just a little bit more about your time in the industry?
Indeed. So you alluded to it very kindly there as you started. So I've spent a lot of time in fast-moving consumer goods, mainly perishables and logistics on a 3PL basis. And I've worked pretty much as a supplier to all the main retailers in various different forms on primary distribution. So that's it's quite a niche area, but it has its own challenges. I always really enjoyed working on that. I think the added challenge of the timings plus also the temperature requirements just added that little bit of spice. It becomes quite a close knit community. So certainly, I've done some work in consultancy on behavioural change consultancy for the Department for Transport for London. A little bit of time there. I've also worked on the other side of the fence as a buyer of freight for various different companies, including what is now Medtronics. It's a healthcare company. Also Wolsey, some project work, and Belkin at Northampton. So a little bit of sort of variety, but very much always worked in the logistics field and sort of took the view of learning the job from the bottom up. So started on the shop floor and traffic desk just to really understand how the business worked and sort of added to it from there. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a background to me in the industry, really. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a whistle-stop tour of what sounds like a really varied career.
Yeah, it has its moments. It's had its moments, certainly. But I think that's what's great is you do get to meet some fantastic people, and I just think about all the people I've worked with over the years, and there's some real characters, and you learn a lot from them, and that's good. And I always think with logistics, it's one of those industries where if you come into it, there's lots of opportunities and lots of misunderstandings about what's involved. And actually, there's so many areas that you can work in that really tick the box for me, whether it be things to do with costings or things to do with marketing or operations or management of people. Everything comes together. And I think it's a real hidden gem that, joking aside, that actually I've always been passionate about. I think there's a certain degree of a bit of a love to hate scenario. And I think a lot of people will say that. At one point, I kind of removed myself from the day-to-day, and I was working in some very sort of comfortable positions. And if I'm honest, I got to the point where it was a little bit, where's the pulse? I lost the pulse again. So I went back into it again. But I learned a lot from it, and I've done lots of things that looking back as a child, and this sounds a bit twee, but when I was very interested in transport from a very young age, I think I look at those jobs that I've done and thought, do you know what, I'm so glad I did that. And I look back to that time when I was younger and thought if I knew that I was going to be doing that, I'd have been really, really chuffed. Certainly, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've heard someone else describe it to me as it's the industry that we all love, but no one would recommend to someone else, which I think is
no. And I think
possibly...
I think the other thing is you're true. I think that's right. I think the other thing everyone does is that everyone in logistics underplays it. Nobody recognises the value of it. Everyone says, "Oh, it's pretty straightforward, and anybody can do it." But if you were a surgeon or if you were a solicitor, that you wouldn't do that. You'd say, "Oh, it's a very complicated job." And I think supply chain is complicated, and that probably comes into quite neatly into some of the mental health challenges that come with that. I think we all very much, we'll just give it a go, and we tell everybody don't go into it and don't would work in it. But I think there's a degree, as you say, there's a degree of people actually really enjoying it, but love to moan about it as well. Maybe that's a British thing. I don't know. Maybe not. So.
Maybe. So, in your long and varied career, if you don't mind me using the adjective long,
no, it's increasingly becoming used, Paddy. So I shouldn't worry about it.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. What do you find stressful in that? What did you find stressful in that?
I think, I was thinking about this sort of last couple of days. It's just had a bit of think about mental health and it's coming up towards the call. And I think it's part of it's communication, or poor communication, because a lot of the stress is caused by information being degraded as it goes through the system. So a classic example is that you'll look at the specs of a job to set the job up, and maybe you don't ask the right questions, or perhaps the person that you're working with doesn't know all the information, and then you go to sort of build up and almost get to a sort of go live phase, and there's lots of information that comes out that wasn't immediately available. And I think that level of stress, whether it be an implementation or whether it be simply just taking a job on, that poor communication causes no end of problems and misunderstanding. And I think in an industry that's quite heavily reliant on remote workers, that is a real problem. And I remember an old boss of mine when I first worked at Turner's at Newmarket, which is a really interesting company to sort of look into. And the manager had always said to me, look, don't have an argument with the driver on the phone. Leave it till late and have the conversation in person that you want to have when they're back in the office, because otherwise it will fester all day. And as it festers all day, that's a representative of the company, so it's in front of the customers. There's also safety of the driver, there's fuel efficiency, a whole load of things. It causes no end of problems. So if you're going to have a discussion, sit down over a brew, proper communication in the office, 10 minutes. It's a much better way of doing it. It might make a longer day, but actually saves you time in the long run. So yeah, I think certainly communication. I also think there's the chance factor. Chance is always a problem. So we can plan the best schedule in the world, but what we don't know is that the driver has a heart attack on a minibus or something, causes the M1 to close. We can't plan for that because there's always the chance factor, and that chance factor's you've got to be quite philosophical in your approach to how you manage that, because inevitably you can't plan for that. I remember talking to a driver from Stobarts who used to do a lot of their international work, and he just used to say, well, traffic's terrible, then there's no point getting stressed about it. I can't do anything about it. So I just put my feet up and wait till it's clear. There's no point getting annoyed about it. So it's, again, a bit philosophical, I think. So for me, definitely communication and chance are the two things that I think are really difficult to manage, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think I can, from my experience in ops, I can definitely relate to that. And at the time, what sort of effect did that stress have on you?
Well, I can remember an example when I drove home from one company, stopped at a lay-by inside a road and bawled my eyes out. So perhaps that gives you an indication of the level of stress that it causes. Because I didn't feel in control of that. I was quite young, and there was quite a lot of responsibility on my shoulders, and I didn't really feel necessarily supported. And I think, as you very conveniently alluded to and very tactfully alluded to, I'm sort of a fair way into my career. So going back to the 20, 25 years, those sort of things weren't things that people really had the same level of influence and interest on. And I think it was very much a case of you just had to take it on the chin and go for it. I think there's a part back to the piece about underplaying logistics. I think there's a danger that we should all, and particularly blokes, we should all just take it on the chin, and that's how it is, and that's just the way it is. You just got to deal with it, live with it. And I think that just builds up. It builds up and it builds up. And I don't think that's very in line with good communication, good culture. I think that's a real shame. I think it's changed, possibly, maybe a little bit, but it's still a problem in the sense of trying to share those issues. And I think my business partner and wife Sara, when she worked in engineering, she had a boss who used to say, if you make a mistake, stand up on the desk, put your hand up, say you've made a mistake. And I think it's this idea of trying to hide things and I can cope with this, and I'm a tough person, etc. Doesn't help. I think diversity in employment is a big thing in the sense of both, whether it be gender, whether it be cultural, or whether it be social, because it brings different views, different things in. And that can get away from that sort of very concentrated culture of we just got to put up with it. Because really, why was I upset that day? I was upset that day because things were going on. I had no control over them. There was no way of changing them, and I felt personally responsible for that. Now, there's an argument to say perhaps I shouldn't have taken that home and I shouldn't have worked with that. But ultimately, a lot of people care about what they do, contrary to popular belief. And I think when things go wrong, as inevitably they can do, This was related to a stock report that was issued, and it was issued incorrectly. So all the codes were in the wrong place. So all the stocks were all over the place, and it was issued live. So the picking started. It was an absolute shambles. But it was only noticed when it went live because I looked at it, thought, oh, I see what's happened here. But of course, I couldn't catch up to get it right. And I had a couple of days of that, and that was it. I was finished. So it doesn't help. And I think you've got to look at it in terms of over the time. I think you back to the philosophical viewpoint. It's understanding, allowing yourself the fact that could happen. So if it does happen, then you're going to be in a much better position. I think when you're young, you probably don't know that, you don't see it, because we're all bits sort of confident and etc. But I think if you can allow for that for experience and think, well, that could happen, then at least you're prepared for it and you can manage it a bit more accordingly. I don't know. It's difficult. I don't think I ever really resolved that particular problem in the end. I think it's just a case of put my tin hat on and trust my luck. But I do think, I mean, having gone to the Women in Logistics conference last year, I can't go this year, but I went last year, and I think there was very much a sort of a different approach, and in terms of from the diversity viewpoint, a bit more of a discussion about, well, how do we deal with these problems? And I think that's a good thing in the sense that often sort of 25 years ago, where it was a lot more of a male culture, it was a lot harder to discuss these things and also put a price on them, because, back to your sort of offering that you do, clearly there's a massive cost associated with not managing this. And I think if we can get it out on the table and people feel they can talk about things in a bit better way, constructively, then we can take some of the pressure off, and then people perhaps don't go home feeling they're fully responsible for something. So that makes a bit of a difference. But yeah, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you make a really good point there around actually once you kind of accept that these things could happen, and you're prepared for that. One of the things we talk about to sort of bring it back to our mental health, then one of the things we talk about in cognitive behavioral therapy is the fact that when something does happen, actually, how bad is that? Is it, if you were, if whatever in your unconscious mind is the worst case scenario, actually, how bad is the worst case scenario? And 99 times out of 100, not that bad in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I think also, I mean, part of what we do with our business is we look at the backdrop to how we can embrace change in a more constructive way. And people say, oh, you can't learn that, but you can learn from experience ways of approaching a difficult situation with a set of from the better phrase, tools or skills, etc. So if you're in a position where you become more used to uncertainties, you've just alluded to, then it becomes less of a problem, and that gives a flex. And I think that's something particularly we notice, that when a company's going through a lot of change, the actual change of the people is the bit that gets forgotten about. The system gets considered, the new ways of working get considered, but the fact that the business has to change, the culture has to change. So certainly, as you say, the piece about trying to build in that allowance, and and I always think, well, like anything, if you're going to involve yourself in a project, if you've got an area where you can take as a resource and it improves the output, why would you not do that? So why do we not look at that, and and why do we not say, right, let's encourage the team to be better at embracing change? I think that builds very nicely into a lot of offerings, particularly for logistics companies, and that's something that we certainly offer for businesses up and down the land. But yeah, I think if you can build that piece in, it makes a difference. And it's just, that's made me think about something else. Is that when I did a lot of planning, when I first did a lot of planning, I again used to get really stressed out by what you can and can't do, and it's, oh, I've got to get this done by 10 o'clock, or I can't do that. And I worked with a guy who always used to say to me, look, something will fall out of bed. Always does. You've got to trust it. Something will fall out of bed. You let's just say, for arbitrary language, you are, quote, 10 over the top, which most people know what that means. So 10 loads you can't cover.
Yeah.
By about 4 or 5 o'clock, 5 of them, someone will ring up and say, I've got a spare lorry tomorrow, or, oh, okay. Or there's one that doesn't need to go in for the work he's doing in the workshop, could be just delayed. It's all things like that. It's learning that, thinking something will happen. I think you've got to have a bit of faith, thinking we'll get to the end of the day and actually things will resolve themselves. But again, that's not an easy one to learn, I don't think.
Yeah.
Certainly.
I Yeah, I remember on that sort of similar topic, I had when I was working for an events company in the middle of London, we had a fire in one of the venues we were working in.
Nice.
And yeah, just off Bank Junction actually. So
Mm.
you can't drive anything bigger than a 3.5 ton through Bank Junction between I remember 6 a.m. and midnight or something like that. I can't remember exactly, but you can't drive anything through there. And this venue was just off the side of that, so there was only one way to get out. And we had this fire, and I think the event was it was a joint event for the Emir of Qatar and the International Red Cross.
Oh,
and
low key then.
Yeah, pretty low key. I think Jessie J was the act. Nothing too.
Yeah,
and with about minor. Yeah, it was chill. It was really chilled. With about sort of 3 or 4 hours until the show, the kitchen went on fire, and so we ended up, and it was the sort of thing that you kind of looked at and you went, there's no way back from this at all. But we had the entire fleet out across London picking up kit and dropping off crew and all this, that, the other across, and we managed to move the show to a new venue and set it all up. And we only went up about an hour late or something like that. And you go, there's no way in hell that should have worked, but it did. Mm. It's just incredible what you can scrape from the bottom of the barrel when you need to.
Well, I think the piece about having the right skills in place is key, because then if you can prepare for as much of it as you can, then the things that you can't deal with, you've got a bit of space to deal with. It's too rigid. And I've seen a lot of transport operations, it's too rigid. And therefore, when things go wrong, like the pandemic, it falls apart because the people are so used to a set way of doing things. And that ultimately, in my experience, logistics is just not really very realistic, to be honest. But they are.
No.
Yeah, interesting.
No, it doesn't. So, the question that all that led on to was what effect that stress has on you. And so my next question was going to be how, I know we got a bit down and sidetracked there, but how do you manage that stress? How does that work for you?
Well, I think, I've had various different injuries, but I think sport has helped. Doing some physical activity helps, certainly. Just gives you a little bit of, get rid of some of the frustration, but then it's building the time in. And if you're working, a lot of people are working on remote sites or working all over the place, then getting back at 9 o'clock at night, you're not going to do that. So I think the timing, that helps. But I think also building in enough, you've got to build enough time in for sleep. People say it, but it's an obvious point, and also downtime. Yeah. And my mum always used to say, go and do some recreation, and then she just re-emphasise it, recreation. And I think that's an important thing, to do something a bit different, take your mind off it. It's very difficult when you're in the midst of something, and I find this, if I'm in the midst of a go live, it's very hard I'll just put my phone off for a couple of hours, that'll be fine. It's not that easy, but I think it's a debit and credit system. If you take too much out of it, you will find that there's nothing left, and you need to put into it. So you need to build some time in for yourself. I don't feel at the minute particularly, I feel I'm fit at the minute, and I tend to stress eat, which doesn't help. That's not great. I don't drink particularly much, so that's not something I tend to do. But I do tend to be a bit heavy on the sweets, snacks, etc., which is not great for me in reality. But that, we all do our things that we do. So I think it's trying to build it in. Probably recognise the fact that actually it has a big impact on you, and I think logistics does take a lot from people. It is very much a 24/7 business. When I worked effectively working for Morrison's, that was a 7-day-a-week piece of work, because things would always happen. They'd always need support, etc. Now, they were a great customer, and building it from $3,000 a week to $145,000 a week in 18 months is pretty good going. But that's done by phone call all the time. Can you do this? Can you do that? Great, it can help them. But ultimately, it becomes it takes over your life if you're not careful. And then that's part of good management, in the sense that you need to hand that on to people and don't try and be a hero. And I've learned that the hard way, sadly.
Yeah, definitely. No, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Delegation of things, and get more people involved, and really understand what your role is, rather than trying to do everything. And I've always been interested, because I like the detail. I always want to get the doing bit. Well, that's not always useful. You take a step back, get more people in to help you, widen the team, get the support, get a team approach to it, rather than trying to take everything on your shoulders, because you'll end up burning out if you're not careful. That's what happens.
Yeah, definitely. And then last but not least, to sort of round us off, what's your top tip for somebody who's on a similar journey to you?
I think I mean, I've learned a fair few things. I think what the most important thing actually is understanding your own worth. I think that because then you'll know what's excessive and what's not, and I think that's about recognizing when something's too much. I really probably, well, I really probably, it's terrible English. I should have put my hand up a bit in those early experiences and said, that's just not on. I'm not going to do that. That's not acceptable. To push back, but I didn't want to push back, so I didn't want to rock the boat. But actually, if I'd had more belief and value of my own worth, I wouldn't have put myself in that position. I probably would have exposed myself to less stress, but I didn't. And that's really understanding what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And I think, you've got to understand what are the warning signs for you as a person. What are the things? So if you're starting to get into bad habits for some reason, maybe that's linked to the fact stress levels building up. So what are the warning signs for you in your career? And I think, if I had have done that, I think I would have been probably in a healthier position. So it really is about what are you prepared to put up with, and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And one of the things that's interesting when we look at, particularly for new recruits, there's always a desire to impress. There's always a desire to get settled in and be one of the team and be performing for your boss, etc. And there's a trade-off between hands-on, getting involved, and being visible, and taking on too much, and then basically trapping yourself in that role. And that you've got to get that balance right, I think, because if you don't, you'll just more and more get put on top of you. You won't say anything, and frankly, the rest of the team, the management team, won't say anything because you've not said anything. You've not identified anything. You've just let it happen. So I think you've got to be aware of your own worth, your own trigger signs, what that means, and then I think then you've got to communicate it and have a very good conversation with people. Be brave enough to say to a line manager or your supervisor, look, this isn't, for these reasons, this is too much for me. And often, if you find that piece, you have the courage to do that, things can be changed. But if you don't do anything, it'll just keep piling up. And that's what I found, which was to my detriment. So we live, we learn, unfortunately, but they are. So, yes, definitely. Indeed.
And just for a quick self plug, that is one of the things that we do at MacBrant, is we help people develop their mental health action plan, and part of that is about recognizing what your triggers are. Actually, what's the signs that everything's going well, what's the signs that things are not going quite so well, and how you deal with that, and how you kind of communicate that to your senior staff or whatever. But yeah, John, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Brilliant.
I really appreciate it. And to the listeners, thank you so much for listening, and I will speak to you all next time.